Okay, thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us for this important event on the history and contemporary struggles against US military presence in the Pacific. My name is Gerard, and I am a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I will be facilitating today's event, which is organized by the International Committee of DSA. This month is also Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and today is also the 42nd anniversary of the Gwangjo uprising in Korea, when ordinary people revolted in a popular uprising against the US-backed military dictatorship of Chun Doo-hwan. In the spirit of the rich history of revolutionary struggles, today we will feature guest speakers from across the Pacific who will talk about the history and ongoing local resistance against US militarism and imperialism. Today's event will be recorded and shared on the DSA Facebook and YouTube afterwards, as well as the DSA International Committee social media and website, where you will be able to find all the resources and info from today's event and about the panelists and organizations. If you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A feature to ask them, and we will try to get to them at the end during the Q&A section. If anyone has specific questions and wants to follow up with DSA, you can email us directly at this email address. And we also want to thank our co-sponsors for helping us promote the event, including Code Pink, World Beyond War, Notatoll, No Cold War, Massachusetts Peace Action, and the Red Nation. As part of our ongoing political education projects in the International Committee and in working to build ties with leftist movements around the world, we organized this event to bring together local left anti-war organizers and activists from across the Asia Pacific who will highlight the important history and current work being done to oppose US militarization and occupation in the Pacific. The significance of this sort of anti-war organizing is of crucial importance now more than ever, as we are seeing increasing conflicts, escalations, and expanding militarization across the world. Over the past decade, the US has increasingly shifted its military focus to the Asia-Pacific as part of a pivot to Asia strategy to counter China's growing influence and to secure US geopolitical and imperialist interests in the region, all part of a longer historical project of US expansionism, colonialism, and imperialism in the Pacific. Today, US military budgets continue to skyrocket to over $800 billion per year, nearing 4% of GDP, with total US military-related spending actually putting the true cost closer to $1.5 trillion. While the US is only 4% of the global population, its military budget accounts for nearly 40% of global military spending, which is more than the next 10 countries combined. The US military is also the largest non-state CO2 emitter in the world, responsible for more emissions than 140 nations combined. In the Pacific region alone, the US currently controls over 400 military bases and 300,000 stationed troops, as well as over 60% of its Navy fleet. Even with all of this, the Pentagon continues to request increasing budgets in the tens of billions for upgrading and expanding weapon systems, military bases, and deployment, all while mainstream media and politicians fall in line, pushing Cold War rhetoric regarding China's role in order to sell to the US public and around the world ever-increasing military budgets to reinforce US imperialist interests. Military alliances like the Quad and the newly established AUKUS, as well as NATO's increasing pivot to the Asia-Pacific, continue exacerbating the situation militarily, all while weaponizing various disputes between China and neighboring countries to legitimize expanding military presence, regularly patrolling warships, and large-scale joint military drills, all of which escalate the situation in the region to dangerous levels. To this end, understanding the importance of fully grasping with the history, current scope, and intent of the US in the region is of primary relevance for any left anti-imperialist project. Today, we will hear directly from comrades in the region, including Dae-Han from South Korea, Seishi Hinada from Japan, Sarah Raymundo from the Philippines, Lisa Natividad from Guam, and Keoni DeFranco from Hawaii, who will each detail some of the local history, current organizing, and local resistance by anti-war organizers, indigenous activists, environmentalists, socialists, and other progressive forces in the Pacific against US militarism, occupation, and imperialism. Before their presentations, we will first hear from Mark Tseng-Putterman for a historical overview of the role of the US in the region. After these panels, we will host a Q&A section with the speakers and then provide further resources at the end for the audience. One of the things we hope to stress in this event is the importance of us all being actively politicized and involved in organizing around building a global left anti-war movement that can oppose rising warmongering rhetoric and help us build towards a world that puts working class interests first. So to start us off and set the historical stage for our other panelists, Mark will first give a presentation on some of this history. Mark Tseng-Putterman is a writer and educator whose work focuses on histories of the US empire and Asian American internationalism. He is currently a PhD candidate at Brown University. His talk today draws on two recent essays, China and the American Lake, published in Monthly Review, and Policing the Borders of Anti-Asian Violence, published in Roar magazine. And Mark, you can take it away.
Great, thanks very much, Gerard, for the introduction, and to the DSA International Committee for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, yeah, it's really an honor to be here, and in particular to speak alongside this international panel of anti-imperialist organizers. Whoops. Let's see. So I've been tasked with providing some historical context for understanding the nature of US imperialism in Asia and the Pacific. And I hope in this short talk to outline in really broad strokes the long historical process through which US imperialism has identified the Pacific region as the linchpin of US global power, a vision of the Pacific as what's been termed an American lake, which continues to guide US policy to this day. So in recent years, we've heard over and over from politicians, business elites, and military strategists that the future of US global power is to be decided in Asia and the Pacific. As Secretary of State Hillary Clinton put it in 2011, the 21st century would be America's Pacific century. Clinton promised that renewed US commitments to the region would, quote, pay dividends for continued American leadership well into this century. And under Barack Obama's pivot to Asia, these commitments took the form of a military rebalancing and the pushing of free trade agreements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Subsequent administrations have continued this diagnosis of Asia and the Pacific as the keystone of continued US hegemony. For instance, the 2018 Trump-era document, the US Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific, similarly called for the maintenance of US diplomatic, economic, and military preeminence in what it describes as the world's most populous and economically diverse region. So as the Department of Defense now designates the Pacific as its priority theater, it is the People's Republic of China in particular that's been marked as the region's primary antagonist. Since at least 2019, the Pentagon has labeled China the United States' most consequential strategic competitor, a so-called revisionist power whose ambitions undermine the project of US regional preeminence. Yet, despite the implied temporality of a new Cold War with China, the United States' identity as a Pacific power comes with long historical precedent, one which National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien invoked in introducing the 2018 Indo-Pacific Framework. He wrote, quote, "The United States is and always has been an Indo-Pacific nation, from the first American trading ships that departed for China just 8 years after the American Revolution." This rare historical transparency reflects the fact that pursuit of China's supposedly limitless markets has been a defining discourse of the United States since its formation. Just as visions of contemporary US empire are staked to the Pacific region, the 19th century formation and expansion of an American continental and overseas empire were shaped by the pursuit of trans-Pacific domination. This Pacific orientation is really at the core of American imperial identity, as depicted in this 1861 mural titled "Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way," in which American settlers look out on the golden horizon of San Francisco's Bay, a golden gate to Asian wealth. From the expeditions of Lewis and Clark to the settlement of California, Oregon, and Washington, and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the violent settler colonial conquest of the continent itself was premised on access to the markets of the Far East. Naval officer Robert Wilson Shufeldt, who led the first US expedition of gunboat diplomacy to Korea in 1882, put this nexus of settler colonialism and commercial empire in intimate terms. He wrote, quote, "The Pacific is the ocean bride of America. China, Japan, and Korea, and their innumerable islands, hanging like necklaces about them, are the bridesmaids. California is the nuptial coach, the bridal chamber, where all the wealth of the Orient will be brought to celebrate the wedding," end quote. And China, long described as the El Dorado of commerce, was the cornerstone of this discourse. American promoters frequently promised that China would be for American imperial capitalism what India had been for the British. Following the pronouncement of the closing of the continental frontier in 1890, the decade of the 1890s crystallized the structure of US Trans-Pacific Empire, consolidating a network of coaling stations, military staging grounds, and market access, which endures to this day. To briefly recount, in 1893, a militia of American settlers, aided by the US Marines, overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom and put in place a settler government. By 1898, the Hawaiian Islands would be formally annexed as a US territory, consolidating American sugar plantation interests while also securing the islands as a so-called halfway house for US ambitions further west into the Pacific. That same year, Spain ceded the Philippines and Guam to the United States at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, beginning an era of US colonial administration and, in the Philippines, the suppression of a Filipino independence movement, which would claim the lives of more than 200,000 civilians over the next 5 years. Somewhat ironically, this decade of violent colonial expansion coincided with a romantic ideal of US anti-colonialism. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay put forth his famous open door notes, a notice to competing imperialist powers stating the United States' opposition to the territorial partition of China. The US demanded the maintenance of the status quo of colonial concessions in which British, Japanese, and American commercial interests could freely compete in treaty ports like Shanghai. Of course, this open system was forged through 2 bloody opium wars over the supposed right of Western traders to traffic opium into Chinese territory. While the United States couched its open door policy as a righteous defense of Chinese sovereignty, the concept is better understood as ushering in an era of free trade imperialism, the capitalist domination of underdeveloped markets without formal colonial rule. Here, it's particularly important to understand the interrelationship between these different forms of imperialism in consolidating US power in the Pacific. Settler colonialism in Hawaii and colonial warfare in the Philippines coincided with the pursuit of an open door empire in China. The China trade loomed large over debates on the annexation of Hawaii and the retention of the Philippines. The administration of President McKinley made this connection clear, stating, quote, "We must have Hawaii to help us get our share of China." Similarly, calls to annex the Philippines as an American colony pointed not only to the inherent value of the Philippines, but also its importance for regional US strategy. Speaking before Congress in 1900, leading advocate of imperialism, Senator Albert Beveridge, insisted on the full retention of the Philippines as a US territory. He stated, quote, "The Philippines are ours forever, and just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. The Pacific is our ocean," end quote. American strategists envisioned the Philippines as what they called an American Hong Kong, a launchpad for commercial and military escapades into China and beyond. And in 1900, the strategic military value was realized. The United States dispatched more than 5,000 American troops from the Philippines to China to join the other imperial powers in suppressing the Chinese Boxer uprising against foreign influence and imperialism. So to jump forward in this chronology a little bit, by the end of World War II, the United States had reconsolidated its grip over the Pacific from the challenge of Japanese imperialism. As the Cold War began, the regional encirclement of Asia shifted registers from a program of commercial penetration to one of anti-communist containment. In the American imagination, China's socialist revolution and the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 slammed shut the long-desired open door. Meanwhile, local socialist and national liberation movements throughout Asia were chalked up to the schemes of Soviet and Chinese intervention. This discourse painted communist China as harboring imperialist ambitions, as depicted in this highly racialized political cartoon, rendering the United States a benevolent protector of what it termed free Asia. In this context, we should remember that the Korean and Vietnam Wars were not discrete affairs, but part of a structure of US imperialism which sought to retain Asia as an uncontested sphere of US domination. This regional calculus shaped the prosecution of US intervention. For instance, the Korean War saw the bombing of Chinese infrastructure at the border of Korea and Northeast China, and General Douglas MacArthur spoke openly of expanding the war into China, an aspiration lobbied for by the nationalist regime in Taiwan, which saw in US intervention in Korea an opportunity to retake the Chinese mainland. This regional structure became even more clear amidst US intervention in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. More than 350,000 South Korean troops fought in Vietnam under the Park regime, as did more than 10,000 soldiers and military workers from the Philippines. Meanwhile, B-52 bombers dispatched from Okinawa conducted bombing raids over North Vietnam. Simulated war exercises in Oahu cast native Hawaiians as enemy combatants, and American GIs engaged in rampant sexual and economic violence in Thailand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and beyond as part of euphemistically termed rest and recuperation tours. To close, I think this history remains relevant because the contemporary consolidation of US military and commercial hegemony in the Pacific to counter China's rise bears all the historical patterns of its formation and extension in the 19th and 20th centuries. Like 19th century Pacific expansion, revived Cold War militarism renders sovereign Pacific island nations from Hawaii to Guam and Okinawa mere island chains bound in strategic containment of China. Likewise, the pattern of Cold War militarization that manifests in permanent US military bases in Korea, the Philippines, and Okinawa are reinscribed as liberal protection of US allies from China's purportedly expansionist aspirations. In reality, this so-called defensive posture simply repackages the historical form and function of US trans-Pacific imperialism. Recent military calls to regain the advantage from China in the region only threaten to intensify this violence. For instance, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, a 2021 budget request for more than $27 billion in congressional funding, is now set to expand missile defense sites in Guam, training facilities in Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands, and expand joint force exercises with Korea and Japan. This regional calculus of US empire requires regional resistance. At this historical juncture, we must link all movements for peace, decolonization, demilitarization, to see how the justification of renewed Cold War aggression with China provides cover for the extension of a trans-Pacific American empire, which has colonized the people's aspirations for peace and sovereignty across the Pacific for more than a century. As the US lays claim to imperial stewardship over what it terms a free and open Indo-Pacific, we must remember that this region contains more than 60% of the world's population and more than half of the surface of the planet. The fight against US empire in Asia and the Pacific is thus truly a global struggle. for self-determination and national liberation, but also for the future of a habitable planet itself. If the 21st century is to truly be a Pacific century, it will be defined not on the terms of the US empire, but by the broad masses of people seeking sovereignty, peace, and cooperation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for that great presentation. Next up, we're gonna have Dae-Han Song from South Korea. Dae-Han Song is part of the International Strategy Center Secretariat and is in charge of the ISC networking team. He has organized for the Labor and Community Strategy Center and Bus Riders Union in LA and API Youth Promoting Advocacy and Leadership in Oakland. The International Strategy Center is a nonprofit organization rooted in Korea's social movements and reaching out to struggles, campaigns, movements, and experiments abroad. It is composed of organizers, researchers, translators, interpreters, students, professors, and political party activists in Korea and abroad. Their strategy is bringing and connecting the alternatives and struggles of those abroad to Korea's social movements, and vice versa. In our globalized world, exchange and solidarity between social movements is the only way we can strengthen our local and global movements to build a world beyond capitalism. Dae-Han, you can take it away.
Okay, my name is Dae-Han Song, and I'm in charge of the networking team for the International Strategy Center. And I'm honored to be among such esteemed activists and organizers. And thank you, DSA International Committee, for all your work in organizing such a space. And so my presentation today will focus on the Republic of Korea, aka South Korea. And I'd like to start with two photos. The photo on the left is basically the then chair of the ruling conservative party, Kim Moo-sung, and he's giving a piggyback ride to the commander of the Combined Forces Command. And this photo was taken July 2nd, 2015. So think of it something like the US Speaker of the House giving a piggyback ride to a foreign military commander, right? And the second photo is a protest in 2002 after the acquittal of 2 US soldiers that ran over and killed 2 middle school schoolgirls, which I'll go over in a bit later. So clearly the relationship is a complicated one. And to understand it, we must go back to South Korea's birth. Immediately after the Japanese surrender on August 15th, the very next day, grassroots people's committees for the preparation of Korea independence spread across the Korean peninsula. Peasants redistributed the land of the Japanese collaborators. Workers defended and took over factories. And on September 6th, a national gathering established the Korea's People's Republic. But on September 8th, the US military entered South Korea and established the US military government. On September 9th, I pulled down the Japanese flag and hoisted up not the Korean one, but the US one. The Korean peninsula was divided and North and South Korea were born. And this proclamation that established the US military government rejected the grassroots movements, the worker cooperatives, and the peasant redistribution of land. Basically, the US came not to liberate, but to occupy and to create a Korean government in its own image. Such a government would be established in the next 3 years, together with conservatives, many of whom had served the Japanese. Thus, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, was born in 1948, followed soon after by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, aka North Korea. In the years leading to the Korean War, the left in South Korea was nearly wiped out. Tens of thousands of leftists that fought against Japanese occupation were killed, tossed down mine shafts, and buried en masse in the mountains. The Cold War birthed and baptized South Korea. The first period of Syngman Rhee lasted until 1961, followed by the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, all of them under the aegis of the United States. Yet if South Korea was born out of the Cold War, it was also shaped and grew up through its people's struggles. So to transition into the focus of my talk today, I wanted to give a few basic facts about the US forces in Korea, the USFK. Currently during war, it is a US general that controls both the US and South Korean militaries. There are about 28,500 US soldiers stationed in Korea. And the US forces in Korea is subsidized by the South Korean government annually. And in 2021, it subsidized it by $1 billion. And Camp Humphreys is the largest US military base outside the United States. What is the character of the US forces in Korea? Well, during the Cold War, it was much like an outpost against communism. Yet after the fall of the Soviet Union, as part of a larger shift consolidated after the 2001 September 11 World Trade Center attacks, the United States adopted a strategic flexibility. This means that the US forces in Korea, while stationed in South Korea, they can be redeployed around the region. An important thing to note is that control of both South Korean and US militaries in Korea has always resided with the US general. In other words, the US government and not the Korean one controls the military in Korea during war. Attempts at transferring wartime operational control to South Korea have been repeated starting in 2007 when an agreement was reached, but the agreement being postponed twice by conservative presidents. And then finally, the last president attempting it, but failing to, in particular because conservatives were able to collect 10 million signatures opposing the transfer of wartime control. What then has been the nature of people's struggles against the US forces in Korea? We can divide the struggle into two. Like one is around the struggle to amend the unequal military alliance, in particular on how it deals with the crimes and the pollutions of the US military. And more importantly, it's involved the struggle for peace and self-determination in the Korean Peninsula. The status of forces agreement, which basically determines how US soldiers and their dependents are treated in South Korea. It means that when US soldiers and their dependents commit crimes, they're tried not by South Korea, but by the US military. While there were countless unpunished crimes, the height of the struggle against these crimes happened in 2002, when two soldiers ran over two middle schools, and then they were found not guilty of negligent homicide. And that brings us to that photo that we saw at the beginning. Of course, this marked massive anti-American sentiment. Another ongoing struggle has been around the US responsibility for the pollution of its military bases. The US forces in Korea has abused the clause in the 1966 SOFA that stated that they could simply return military bases as they were. Later, protests would pressure the US forces in Korea to amend SOFA to address contamination that was known, imminent, and substantial endangerment. Of course, the problem becomes that all these are very vague words, and as they're vague, they're also very contestable. So today, less than 44% of the 40-kilometer square of vacated military bases have been returned. So as I mentioned before, South Korea shifted towards, the US forces in Korea shifted towards strategic flexibility, and as such, they started consolidating a lot of their military bases that were north of the Han River towards south of the Han River. And as these bases were closing down and transferring, they were leaving behind a lot of pollution. Many of them remain polluted ghost towns, and of the ones that have been returned, over half of them are polluted with oil, toxins, and heavy metals. As of 2017, South Korea spent $200 million cleaning up the vacated bases, and the US forces in Korea have paid nothing. Often the pollution is a result of neglected facilities, such as this oil tanker, right? It is much cheaper for the US to do nothing, rather to do nothing and then simply return polluted land that it's unaccountable for, than to have to clean up and maintain its facilities. A FOIA request found that the US forces in Korea themselves acknowledged at least 84 instances of oil spills inside the Yongsan Army Garrison Base, which is the main military base, which was the main military base. There are seven instances of spills over 1,000 gallons and 32 instances of spills over 110 gallons. As regards to people's struggles of peace in the Korean Peninsula, they have recently taken various forms. In 2016, a struggle emerged against the creation of a THAAD base, which is supposed to defend South Korea from North Korean missiles, but it can't defend 50% of the population that resides in the Seoul metropolitan area. However, it can spy and map out China's missile system. So because of that, it puts South Korea in this awkward position between the United States and China. And the struggle still continues for completion. It still continues against the completion of construction. Starting 2011, villagers and allies also fought against the construction of a naval base for US and ally Aegis destroyers like battleships meant to secure nearby maritime commercial routes against China. If it's not clear by now, the Korean War hasn't ended. Since 1988, North Korea has pursued peace with the United States based on phased denuclearization in exchange for security assurances. And a major breakthrough was achieved on June 15, 2000 with the Sunshine Policy between South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and North Korean President Kim Jong-il. Since then, building inter-Korean peace has involved the strategy of increasing exchange, cooperation, reconciliation, and peace. Recently, Moon and Kim, South Korea's Moon Jae-in and North Korea's Kim Jong-un paved the way for a peace treaty, which Trump seemed to be willing to exploit to promote himself. Yet the process was ultimately derailed as the Trump administration committed the same mistake that countless US administrations have in not understanding North Korea's security concerns and demanding denuclearization in one step rather than a phased-out approach. Finally, I wanted to briefly introduce our work. We seek to create solidarity and exchange between social movements in Korea and abroad by facilitating and carrying out exchange, joint solidarity, education, research, translation, and interpretation. And we're made up of foreigners and Koreans inside Korea and around the world. And yeah, please stay connected with us. You could subscribe to our newsletter through this link or connect with us in social media through these handles. Many of these struggles continue as part of a larger movements for peace. And here are two of the main ones. And we're also more than happy to connect and coordinate with these struggles as well. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dae-Han. Next up, we're going to have Seishi Hinada from Japan. Seishi Hinada is a member of ZENCO, the National Assembly for Peace and Democracy, as well as MDS, the Movement for Democratic Socialism in Japan. He will make a short report on the struggles against the construction of a new US military base in Henoko, Okinawa, and the ZAP campaign, the ZENCO Henoko Anti-Base Project, which DSA has also been organizing with. Hinada, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jiro-san. Hello, my name is Hinada. Thank you for inviting me to this international panel. I will talk about ongoing struggles against construction of a new US military base in Henoko, Okinawa. Next slide, please. This is a map of Okinawa and surrounding areas. Please look at the positional relationship of Tokyo, Okinawa, Seoul, Manila, Guam. The arc-shaped area surrounding Okinawa, drawn in red color, is the southwestern islands, or so-called the Ryukyu Arc, the center of which is Okinawa Island. Next slide, please. The Ryuky Kingdom was an independent country ruled by the Ryukyu dynasty until it was invaded by Japan in 1609. It had a trading-friendly relationship with China. It is said Ryukyu had a demilitarized culture of non-weaponry. In 1879, the Meiji Japanese state forcibly annexed the Ryukyu Kingdom and established Okinawa Prefecture. Toward the end of the Asia-Pacific War, US troops landed on Okinawa Island on April the 1st, 1945, and Okinawa became the only place in Japan where fierce ground battles were fought. It is said that 120,000 people, which was a quarter of the population, were killed in the battle. After defeating the Japanese Empire, the Allied forces headed by the US General Headquarters occupied Japan. It was then that the building of US bases started in Japan. In mainland Japan, ex-Japan Imperial Navy's airports were expropriated by the US and were turned into US military bases. In Okinawa, however, US troops forcibly deprived the islanders of their land for bases, while residents were forced into internment camps. They say our land was taken by bayonet and bulldozer. A typical example of this is Futenma Air Base. In 1952, San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed and Japan regained its sovereignty, but Okinawa was abandoned by Japan and remained under US rule. The Japan-US Security Treaty was enacted at the same time, and the US secured the prerogative to freely use more than 100 US bases stationed in Japan. On May the 15th, 1972, control of Okinawa was returned to Japan from the US. It was the 50th anniversary just 3 days ago. Okinawans hoped that reversion of control to Japan would mean a denuclearization and sharing the burden of hosting US military bases. However, as this line graph shows, after the reversion, the share of US military bases in Okinawa increased from 50% of the bases to 70%. Nuclear weapons are deeply suspected to exist in storages in Okinawa. Okinawa land area occupies only 0.6% of all the Japanese land territory, but more than 70% of areas exclusively used by the US military in Japan is still concentrated on the small island. Like any other local communities that host US bases, Okinawans have suffered from violence and crimes caused by US soldiers. To look at the years only after 1972, more than 6,000 criminal cases caused by US military personnel have been revealed. And among them, 581 are heinous crimes like sexual assault and murder. Military-related accidents are countless and daily occurrence. In September 1995, three US soldiers sexually assaulted a 12-year-old girl. Indignation, which had been fermenting for a long time after the war, exploded because of this case. The perpetrators were first protected by an unequal clause in Status Forces Agreement, SOFA. According to the clause, if suspects escape into US bases, Japanese police cannot detain them until they are charged. This meant Okinawa police were unable to directly interrogate these US soldiers suspected of sexual assault. This added fuel to the fire. On October the 21st, 85,000 people rallied in Ginowan City. Then Governor Dr. Masahide Ota apologized to the crowd of people, saying, "I must apologize as governor, who should first and foremost protect the dignity of a vulnerable girl, but failed to do so." The anger of Okinawan people was directed not only at the bases, but also the uneven SOFA, Status Forces Agreement, and Japan-US Security Treaty itself. The ruling class were driven to a corner and had to do something to pacify the people's anger. This is why the US and Japanese governments set up a Special Action Committee on Okinawa, aka SACO, and issued its final report a year later in 1996. It said that they would return Futenma Air Station in 5 to 7 years. This was 20 years ago now. This is Marine Corps Air Station Futenma, the most dangerous base in the world, they say. It lies right in the middle of Ginowan City. You can see a lot of dots in different colors. These are kindergartens, elementary schools, high schools, universities. There are 120 public facilities in all. You can see how people's lives are pressed by the base. In 1998, a military helicopter crashed on Okinawa International University. In 2019, a metal window frame of a military helicopter fell on the playground of Futenma Second Elementary School. Recently, toxic water waste contaminated by PFOS leaked out of a base into a river, which is used for drinking water in a residential area. The Japanese government chose Henoko as a site for an alternative facility of Futenma. They started to fill the bay with landfill in December 2018. That was over 3 years ago. However, as Mr. Okuma explained in a DSA online panel in March, the construction plan has a lot of serious defects and issues that make the base impossible to be completed. First, issue number 1, super soft seabed in Oura Bay that goes down as deep as 90 meters. Over 70,000 sand piles should be driven into the bed for reinforcement, but no workboat is available to reach that depth. Issue number 2, right below the site run 2 fault lines that are suspected to be active, and they run sandwiching Henoko munition storage. Issue number 3, Henoko construction site is right in the middle of Hope Spot, a designation given by Mission Blue to international locations, home to many diverse species. It's home to sea animal, endangered dugongs, and precious coral reefs. Here, please watch the next footage taken by Youth Zenko delegation to Okinawa a week ago. Yeah, this is the coral reef that exists in the Oura Bay. Zenko members are watching this through the glass, what they call glass boat. This is from Oura Bay. Yeah, we can see how pristine nature is reserved there. Thank you very much, Nick-san. Yeah, I will continue. Issue number 4, the embankments are not earthquake resistant enough. A recent government report says there is a possibility of a magnitude 7 to 8 class big earthquake occurring around the southwestern islands, which will surely cause the embankments to collapse. And the issue number 5, Henoko Base's 2 runways do not meet the length required to be used as a standard airport, civilian or military. This fact was pointed out by GAO, US Government Accountability Office, in 2017. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the GAO report in 2017. You can see the length of runways of these bases, you see. Henoko planned the runways is very short, 1,800 meters. This is including the overrun area. So in reality, substantially, it's even shorter than that. Thank you. Next slide. Yeah, these pictures are present Henoko site. The picture on the left is of the present view of the Henoko site, taken from an angle often used by the Japanese government. This picture makes it seem as though most of the landfill process has already been completed. So the government uses this picture to make people give up. However, if seen from the Oura Bay side, like in the picture of the right, you see that the vast area is still not filled. It's no more than 8% of the total earth and sand necessary to complete has been filled. Even on the Henoko side, an additional 6 to 8 meters of landfill depth must be added. It is 3 years since they started the reclamation work. 8% after 3 years. How many more years are necessary to complete the space? 30 years or 40 years. In 2013, the Okinawa Defense Bureau said construction of the base would take 10 years and cost 230 billion yen. But according to Okinawa Prefecture's own estimate, construction will cost 10 times as much, and it's impossible to tell when the base will be completed. Even the US establishmentarian think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, says that completion of the construction is nowhere in sight. But both governments continue to stick to Henoko, saying that Henoko is the only solution for returning Futema. Tokyo emphasizes that both parties are in complete agreement on this point. Why? The Japanese government has its own scheme, that is to send its military abroad and maintain its permanent military presence overseas. The purpose is to protect the rights and interests of the Japanese global capital that is accumulated all over the world. Henoko will be the main outpost for the dispatch of troops. Tokyo is trying to realize this goal by strengthening and emphasizing its military ties with the US. Military tension with China, DPRK, and Russia gives Japan a golden opportunity and excuse to achieve this goal of military expansion. The recent catchphrase, free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, should be seen in this context. Japan already has an overseas military base operating in Djibouti in the northeastern tip of the African continent, where Japan imposes status of forces agreement more unequal than the one between the US and Japan on Djibouti. Currently, the Japanese government is militarizing and fortifying not only Okinawa Island, but the whole area of the southwestern islands. Next slide, please. In the southwestern islands, missile bases, munition depots, radar sites, runways for field carrier landing practice are being constructed. Henoko sits in the center of this whole scheme of militarization of the area. Therefore, if we can make them give up, it will be a deadly blow to the Japanese military strategy as well as the Japan-US military alliance itself. It will be a great step forward to building peace and detente in the far East Asian region. When the government celebrated the 50th, celebrated inverted comma, the 50th anniversary of Okinawa reversion, Jinshiro Motoyama staged a hunger strike just outside the Prime Minister's official residence. He is one of the young leaders who initiated the prefectural referendum on Henoko base construction in 2019. The result of the referendum showed over 72% of voters opposed the new base in Henoko. Of course, the general opinion in Okinawa stays intact. The Henoko base construction has been delayed for so long. The main factor is people's struggle and resistance. Even under this pandemic, protesters regularly engage in sit-ins in front of the Camp Schwab to prevent construction. Recently, Zenko youth visited the site and listened to what a sit-in striker had to say too. Next footage is from before the pandemic started in April 2018 in front of Camp Schwab. Can we see it? Yes, thank you. People got together in front of Camp Schwab to prevent the dumping cars carrying earth and sand going into the dumping site. Yeah. There are a lot of riot police, but people were united. Most of the residents in the local area and supporters, even from mainland Japan. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. This is a flyer for Zenko Online Speaking Tour 2022. We invite 8 speakers not only from Okinawa Island, but from other southwestern islands like Miyako, Ishigaki, and Amami. From May 28 to June the 5th, we hold meetings at 8 different cities in Japan to raise our anti-base voices against militarization and fortification of the whole southwestern islands. Next slide, please. And we are now working with DSA International Committee to spread ZHAP, Zenko Henoko Anti-Base Project campaign. This campaign is to send out the anti-base message from Henoko, Okinawa to the peace and justice loving international community to press the US government to give up this absurd scheme. By doing so, we aim to strike a wedge into Japan-US alliance and stop the construction of a new base in Okinawa. Please visit Zenko or ZHAP website, and you can sign petitions for this cause, and please circulate the message. We will keep standing firm in solidarity with people struggling against war and militarization in other places in the East Asia and islands in the Pacific, as well as in the United States. Long live international solidarity, long live. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Hinada. Next up, we will hear from Sarah Raymundo from the Philippines. Sarah is the International Liaison Officer of Bayan, the New Patriotic Alliance, a coalition of left-wing Philippine organizations. She organizes for Commission 1, the cause of national liberation of the International League of People's Struggle, and chairs the Philippines Bolivarian Venezuelan Friendship Association. She is a columnist at the Philippines online progressive journalism platform, bulatlat.com, and hosts the Kodao Productions podcast, Itanago Mokai Prof, Ask the Professor with Filipino revolutionary Jose Maria Sison. She is an associate editor of the Journal of Labor and Society and is a full-time faculty at the Center for International Studies at the University of Philippines, Diliman. Sarah, you can take it away.
Okay, so US militarism in the Philippines. The Balikitan Exercises. Let me begin with the Balikitan Exercises that started in March 28 and ended in April 28. So Balikatan is a Tagalog word for shoulder to shoulder. It is a long-standing bilateral exercise highlighting the deep-rooted partnership between the Philippines and the United States. This Balikatan is a critical opportunity to work shoulder to shoulder with Philippine allies toward a free, open Indo-Pacific that is more connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient, as our Indo-Pacific strategy calls for. So this is a statement made by U.S. Charge of Affairs Interim Heather Barabia. So it is quite ironic that after barely 31 years, which is just recent history. In September 1991, the Filipino people's victory over the US military bases was applauded by the world. Yet, just 31 years after, US troops are back with over 5,000 of them working with almost 4,000 soldiers from the AFP, or the Armed Forces of the Philippines. So this is a short history of the Republic of the Philippines, United States, 1947 Mutual Basis Agreement. And of course, the history of US militarism in the Philippines did not just start in 1947. It started in when the United States hijacked the victory of the Katipunan Revolution, or the one that was led by Andres Bonifacio in 1896 against our Spanish colonizers. So by 1898 and onwards to the US-sponsored Commonwealth and the building of the Philippine Republic, American figures like Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, and William Howard Taft became the architects of the Philippine military strategy. So these are the 1947 Mutual Basis Treaty covered this much. land. And this is obviously a way of dispossessing millions of Filipino farmers and fisherfolk from basically leading a decent life. So that was thousands upon thousands hectares of arable lands with rich agricultural and mineral potentials. And this is why the history of militarism in the Philippines after the Second World War, when the United States became the global hegemon, is marked by a disparate exchange in trade. So before this, the Philippines, along with the other colonies, was a site of the drain of value from the global south to the global north. In the second half of the 20th century, this unequal exchange was translated into a disparate exchange, as Peter Custers call it, where military largesse of the United States to a semi-colony like the Philippines would double, triple, even quadruple for the profits of the United States. And of course, this has everything to do with the military sector being a very reliant sector for regulating the crisis of capitalism and imperialism. So the US is the major arms exporters to the Philippines, even post US bases treaty, even that one was abrogated. And in the current dispensation under both Trump and Biden, the Philippines under Duterte enjoyed US military largesse with its purchase of new aircraft and other hard assets. In fact, amidst the pandemic and severe unemployment, Duterte announced a planned purchase of the 15 S-7I Black Hawk helicopters. So these are mainly manufactured by the military industrial complex located in the global north. And so basically it is to upgrade our aging fleets. We also received notification from the US Congress that the US State Department potential sales of attack helicopters and missiles to the Philippines worth a combined $2 billion. And this was back in 2020 up to 2021. So basically, under Joe Biden, the United States is looking at bolstering the two nations' 70-year treaty alliance by upholding the Visiting Forces Agreement, which was signed by President Barack Obama and Ninoy Aquino. And the Visiting Forces Agreement has definitely paved the way for staging a theater of war against Chinese incursions in the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, despite that, Washington refuses to be transparent on US arms sales. But we all know that it uses tax dollars to fund death squads and human rights violators from within the Duterte government. So this particular partnership has also sabotaged the peace talks between the insurgents or the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, representing the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army. This counterinsurgency program is directly related to US militarism in the Philippines. In fact, Duterte was pressured by the armed forces of the Philippines that's been taking orders from the US State Department to sabotage the peace talks that would have discussed on the peace table the comprehensive agreement on social and economic reforms. And back in 2020, instead of after canceling the peace talks in 2018, at the height of the pandemic, Duterte imposed the anti-terror bill, of course, which the Filipino people really rallied against. And this particular anti-terror bill is in full swing and has, of course, benefiting from US military largesse. Recently, we witnessed after the May 9 elections that is marred with fraud, massive disinformation, red tagging, killings, and vote buying. President Joe Biden was the first one to actually congratulate Bongbong Marcos, the son of the dictator Marcos, the US-backed dictator who ruled the Philippines for 20 years. And those were the martial law years when the Philippine military was super politicized and was, of course, being controlled by the US, the United States. And according to Biden, he foresees a stronger alliance with this presumptive regime. And of course, Bongbong Marcos, who denies the dark years of martial law, the accountability of his family in relation to the suffering of thousands upon thousands of Filipino people, is just too happy to forge so-called diplomatic ties with the US. So what are our calls? Bayan calls for the abrogation of the Visiting Forces Agreement, as well as the cancellation of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, which is the mother treaty of all the US-Philippines basis agreement. We also call on our comrades from different parts of the world who are fighting US wars, US endless wars, US military aggression, to support and to continue struggling against US military bases in Asia and in different parts of the world. We also, of course, would want to extend our hands to all of our comrades worldwide who are building the anti-war movement, an anti-war movement that is also and necessarily an anti-imperialist movement that lifts up the cause and the struggles of the peasants. In our case, the peasant struggle reflects our aspirations towards the right to self-determination. The peasant struggle here in the Philippines, whether that it's underground or above ground, is a struggle that directly challenges US imperialism by painstakingly raising the agrarian question, which is the national question. And so this particular struggle is at the core of our anti-fascist struggle that, of course, also aims to defeat tyrants and imperialists, to defeat fascism, and towards building a bright socialist future. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Up next is Lisa Linda Natividad from Guam, or Guahan in Chamorro. Lisa Linda Natividad is a professor of social work and chair at the University of Guam. She is the primary convener of the Guahan Coalition for Peace and Justice, a founding member of Iagan Fameloan Guahan, and a member of the International Peace Bureau's Advisory Council. She is an indigenous Chamorro woman who has championed the exposure of the human rights violations against her people and homeland Guahan, which is a military colony of the United States. She has spoken globally on the topics of demilitarization, decolonization, and the critical role women play in the creation of safe and thriving communities. Dr. Natividad has presented interventions on halting of the massive military buildup on Guahan before the United Nations Fourth Committee, Decolonization Committee, and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Buenas and hafa day, everyone. And thank you very much, Sizos Masi, to our organizers for this event, and to be able to give us an opportunity to share our story as colonial subjects of the United States. So in looking at our Guahan story, I always begin with where we are. For some, the idea of Guahan is implanted in terms of watching war movies, particularly in the context of the US and in World War II. And so just for purposes of clarification, we are located in the North Pacific, and I have my cursor here sharing. It's literally a star on this map. We're a tiny little island in the Micronesian region of the Pacific, particularly in the Mariana Island chain. And as you can see, our region of Micronesia is a splattering of different small islands throughout, with close proximity to places such as Hawaii, as well as the Philippines and the rest of Asia. And so in this slide, we see how Guam is centered in terms of a number of and varying military triangles that are used for exercises. And just so you can see here, for example, our proximity even to an exercises with Australia to the south, as far to the west as Seoul, up into Japan and Okinawa, and even as far as Hawaii and beyond that, to San Diego in California and to Alaska as well. And so you can see our positionality in the region is very critical, and not just our geographical location is significant, but also our colonial status, which makes us very desirable for the United States and its US imperialistic plans. And so this is a zoom into our island. And as you can see here in this map, to the north, we have what has become very popularized, the Anderson Air Force Base. And this is largely popularized because if the US were to do a preemptive attack on the DPRK, those planes would, or B-2 bombers would be activated from this base here in the north. And then to the south, we have a naval base here in Apra Harbor, which has been largely fortified for decades, stemming back to before World War II. And so who are we? As indigenous Chamorros, we've been in our lands for they're around 4,000 years. So we have a very long history. This is our lineage. This is our heart. We are very much connected to land, as are other indigenous peoples throughout the world. And our legends tell us of humanity being born of Foha Rock, which is this here in the southern village of Humatak. And so looking at our historical context, the Western world stumbled upon us in around about the mid-1500s. The Spanish later came, particularly setting up Catholic missions in the mid-1600s, and thus began our colonization of our land. We continued to be a Spanish possession up until the end of the Spanish-American War. Similar history, I know, that's been shared in this webinar, as well as in the framing historical context of the first presenter. And we continued to be this US possession up until a brief period in World War II between 41 and 44, when the Japan Imperial Army invaded us. And then in 44, the US came back to reoccupy our island. And we've had little incremental steps in terms of addressing our political status issues. And the most recent being in 1950 is the passage of the Organic Act of our island that created our local government of Guam. Chamorros continue to be one of the longest colonized peoples in the entire globe. We are on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories, have been on that list since its inception, and continue to be on it, of which there are only 17 remnants of us in the world. And so as colonial subjects, our second-class citizenship renders a number of inequalities. We are US passport holders, not by choice. However, we do not have a vote for the US president, even though we receive a ballot for the vote. It is a straw poll and it has no power or significance. We elect a congressional representative or delegate to the US Congress. However, that person has what is called no true vote. So they are able to symbolically participate in votes. However, when their vote is the determining factor of or is a tiebreaker, then their vote becomes null and void, which essentially is representative of the illusion and creates the illusion of inclusion and power and representation when in fact there isn't. In addition, we receive limited federal funding. One report that came out of the US Congress, a GAO report, indicated that territories receive about 1/7 the funding that is afforded to US states. And we are excluded from a number of different standard US social programs that oftentimes are safety nets, such as unemployment insurance or disability insurance through the Social Security program. As well, we have a number of restrictive federal territorial policies that do not allow us to fully develop economically and to thrive. And so when we look at this colonial context, one thing I didn't mention earlier, although I showed you our map, we are a very small place. The island is roughly 212 square miles in area, and our population base is less than 160,000 people. So you can imagine the difficulty we have in terms of organizing, because for us, a big protest means getting about 200 people on the street will be huge for us. Although we did accomplish once 2,000 people on the street in response to a US colonial decision that was made. And so militarization for us has meant a lot of things. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide other than to say that, you know, as in the case of the Pacific pivot during Obama's time, 2011, we are a huge part and a critical piece in terms of the web of the US's military plans that spreads its tentacles into the Pacific. And so I wanted to share a quote from Captain Robert Lee, who is one of the top military personnel at one point in time, who stated here on Guam, and he stated, "We're seeing a realignment of forces away from Cold War theaters to Pacific theaters, and Guam is ideal for us because it is a US territory and therefore gives us maximum flexibility." And so you can see the subtle illusion, the subtle reference here to our political status as a colony, and them essentially having free reign in terms of decisions and what they wish to do here. And so the US's military legacy to Guam, what has it meant? First, lots of toxic contamination, as is consistent across military or base communities. And with that, of course, the devastation on our environment and our land. Where there's toxicity, there's poor health outcomes. In addition, their presence here has meant the prohibition of traditional practices. A lot of our traditional medicines grow naturally behind military fences, and we are not able to access those plants, as well as the prohibition of access to traditional fishing grounds, largely with the latest agenda of marine preserves that don't allow us, as well as the military bases having the prime lands on our island, which of course includes access to the ocean. There's been land acquisition, different percentages over time. At present, it's roughly between 29 and 31%, depending on which properties you count. And at one time, following World War II, was as high as almost 80% of the land being occupied. We have a segregated school system, unapologetically by the Department of Defense, and ultimately their presence here, their occupation of our land, has resulted in the deferment of our political right to self-determination. The first list of consequences of the military's presence here was radiation exposure. Most are familiar with the testing that happened in the Marshall Islands, particularly Bikini Island here. And so our island is within the radius of radiation exposure and within direct downwind of the Marshalls. And as a result, we are exposed in some records indicate as high as those in those particular islands to radiation. And clearly our environment and its toxicity and our health outcomes indicate and evidence that contamination. Other information that has been shared with us in terms of access to the information, which is oftentimes blocked, is that there have been over 95 toxic sites on Andersen Air Force Base and the Naval Base in the South. And they're in different statuses of cleanup, supposedly. And oftentimes it's the case that it's so toxic, highly toxic, that cleanup is really beyond a foreseeable act in terms of restoring the land to life. In addition, our tiny island of 212 square miles has over 30 Superfund sites, which is the US Department of the EPA's designation as the most toxic sites in the country. And so we have over 30 of those, and of course, largely connected to military practices in the present and in the past. And so when we look at our health records, this is a really old study, but it clearly illustrates, in looking at death certificates over a 25-year period, indicated that Chamorros were at highest risk for cancer. And in addition to that, the findings reveal that the villages of Jigo and Santa Rita had the highest incidence rates when adjusted appropriately using epidemiological calculations. And those two villages are where the two bases are located and situated. This slide shows, and I just picked a number of different random types of cancer, ranging from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, nasopharyngeal cancer, all the way to cancer of the lung and bronchus. And as you can see here, this blue bar here in turquoise is our rates as Chamorros per 100,000 cases. And this green bar is the rates of the US national average of the same types of cancer, also per 100,000. So you can see gross overrepresentation of illness, in this case cancer, which is a pretty common formula across different conditions when you look at Chamorros and health. And so what's happening here, crazy as this may sound, we also have the highest rate of enlistment as territories. And, you know, between us, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, we all kind of bop up and down in terms of who's the champion at the top with the highest risk. Not that it's something to be proud of in terms of an outcome, but when you've got the highest rates of enlistment, as we do, largely consistent with poor communities, because economically we fare the worst in comparison to the United States numbers, you're going to see high rates of enlistment. Where there's high rates of enlistment, you're going to see high rates of death as a result of military participation or enlistment. And so you see here in this slide, from Guam, you have 5.8 cases per 100,000 of deaths due to wars. In this case, Iraq and Afghanistan, in comparison to the US's average of 1.44, and then its various states don't even begin to touch the rate of incidence of death from wars, or those two particular wars. And in addition to that, we see lots of land dispossession. As I shared earlier, our island is 1/3 controlled by the US Department of Defense. That's more than all private landowners combined and more than our local government of Guam. Their presence extends into the sea and into the air. Most recent, lots of discussion about not just the erection of a THAAD, but multiple ranges of THAAD on our little island, which is very troubling for us, particularly in light of our connection to land. Some policies that they've instituted over time have included the prohibition of our use of our native language. And in response to all of this, and you know, our speaker from Okinawa shared and illustrated very much their resistance. And so we work very closely with activists in Okinawa, working together in solidarity in outcry, because in 2006 was the announcement of the relocation of of US troops from Okinawa to Guam. The number that was given at the time was 8,000 Marines. And so you saw what we ended up doing through the NEPA process was resisting that as best we could. There was over 10,000 public comments that were submitted in that NEPA process in resistance and in opposition. And so as we've moved forward over time, that construction continues to move forward against our wishes. And you see a number of different things happening, one of which is the desecration of sacred sites in the construction of the bases, as well as the violation of agreements that we've had with the US military in terms of respecting our cultural properties. You see this here picture is of the Hodzun Lagu tree, which was the sole mature tree of an indigenous tree. And so our governor called for a pause on the military construction while we address the needs of and protection of this tree. And that was denied by the US Department of Defense on island. And so we continue to resist. And our largest or single most active organization at the moment is called Protehilitex and Save Tidian. And so we've done a number of different actions in this regard. I've listed here the Facebook page, which lists petitions and other things that you can subscribe to in support of our movement. And so in closing, I just wanted to talk or to mention the very important role of international solidarity as we move forward. We on Guam were really behind the power curve when we first heard of this announcement in 2009. And lovingly, activists from Okinawa, Japan, and throughout the world, really, particularly through the International Network of Women Against Militarism, have reached out and are working together. And the other threat that we're seeing, as is indicated down here with the Red Hill Solidarity, is the assault on our water and our access to clean water, not just from military contamination, but also from construction over our island's only aquifer. And so in closing, I just wanted to say, Sizuz Maasi, thank you very much for your time. And that when we look at communities such as our own that bump up against military bases that really are infiltrated by militarism that we reject, what's at stake for us truly is our very survival. Sizuz Maasi, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. Up next, we're gonna hear from Keoni DeFranco from Hawaii. Keoni DeFranco is a Kanaka Maoli Kaiahi, a native Hawaiian guardian of land and water rights, and an organizer of Oahu Water Protectors, which has been involved with the local organizing to shut down Red Hill. He leads Malama Venture Studio, an Oahu-based organization which focuses on building regenerative community-based jobs rooted in Hawaiian culture and innovative technology. Keoni is a member of the nation of Hawaii, assisting in their right for sovereignty and self-determination, and was a frontline activist at Mauna Kea and Standing Rock. Keoni, you can go ahead.
My name is Keoni DeFranco, and I live in Waimanalo on the windward side of the island of Oahu. My ohana, or family name, is Naholowa'a, and originally hails from Kohala on Mokuo Keawe, the island of Hawaii. I wanted to begin by sharing an oli or chant composed by Auntie Pua Case, a leader of the movement to protect Mauna Kea. The chant begins by calling to our Hoa'aina, our fellow Hawaiians, our Hoa Velalike, our Pacific cousins, including every one of my fellow panelists. If the Pacific Ocean touches your borders and mine, then we are family. Our Ho'apili, our indigenous cousins fighting American imperialism all over the world, and our Hoa Aloha, all of our allies around the world who stand shoulder to shoulder with us in our battle for freedom. Aina, Velolike, aloha, uglue na uglue hai, mau magagua, magagayo, hoe, gugia imau, boa gugu, ili gabualoa, guavaiola. This chant describes our movement as strong as a mountain, strong as a tree, strong as a rock, and calls for our movements to rise like a mighty wave. Hawaii's strategic location in the Pacific has made it the nerve center of American imperialist ambitions and operations in the region. Hawaii is one of the most densely militarized regions under US control. The military occupies 200,000 acres, or roughly 20% of the land across the entire island chain, and 22% of the land on Oahu. Today, the military has 50,000 active duty personnel and 85,000 dependent stations in Hawaii, making up 11% of the state's residents. By comparison, the Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian population in Hawaii is about 250,000, or 20% of the total state population, while representing 50% of its homeless. The total global Kanaka Maoli population is about 525,000, meaning that almost half of our people have already been displaced from our homeland. The median price of a home on Oahu just hit a record high of 1.2 million. The central conflict between Native Hawaiians and the military is over the control of land, an issue which is tied to the question of sovereignty and cultural survival. Hawaii continues to exist as a sovereign nation under military occupation. The military occupies the richest and most strategic locations, including important religious sites, fishing, farming, hunting, and gathering areas, making food sovereignty a constant challenge. 90% of our food is imported, making us particularly vulnerable to natural disasters and global events that might disrupt shipping and the food supply. Prior to Western contact, we supported a population of up to 1.5 million with vast regenerative agricultural systems, which were dismantled for extractive and exploitative industries, such as sugar. The Kanaka Maoli story begins with the Kumolipo, our creation chant. Thousands of lines long, this chant showed a deep scientific understanding of the creation of the world and the biological evolution of humans. From darkness, Po, came light. From microbes in the ocean evolved sea life. From mammals walking onto land came the Kanaka, humans. We understood our deep genealogical connection to the ocean, to the land, and to all living things, and lived harmoniously in a regenerative agricultural society. The Polynesians left South Asia, most likely Taiwan, in 5,500 BC, traveling east through the Pacific Ocean, following the direction of shark migrations, who seasonally swam from underwater hotspot to hotspot. They followed the direction of the sun during the day and course corrected using the stars at night. They discovered and arrived in Hawaii in different waves between 400 and 900 AD. Our people had a deep reverence for our Aumakua spirit guides who led us home. We understood our place in society as stewards of the land and ocean. Since time immemorial, we stood as kia'i, protectors and guardians of our natural resources, land, and water. Pre-Western contact, we lived on communal land and a highly organized agricultural system with shared resources divided by region in an ahupua'a structured system. It was critical to keep the water flowing, uninterrupted from mountain to ocean. When diverted for agriculture, the water was always brought back to the stream. Today, our water rights are consistently challenged by corporations illegally diverting water for commercial purposes, leading to droughts in places like West Maui. We lived in a values-oriented spiritual system using myth-telling blended with science to impose the importance of conservation of natural resources. To the Kanaka, we understood that when a place was deemed sacred, such as Mauna Kea, it generally indicated that the area held life-giving natural resources, such as water. 1778 was the beginning of Western contact and the displacement of our people. Cook's End was on Hawaii Island in South Kona as he attempted to kidnap King Kalaniʻopuʻu. From Cook's arrival, the population dropped from 1.5 million down to 40,000 Kanaka alive. In 1850, Kanaka made up 98% of the population of Hawaii. 46 years later, in 1896, that shrank to 36%. This is where we begin to see the colonial settler state emerge. To tell a long story quickly, after initial Western contact, Hawaii became a favored trading route between Asia and the Western world, and sugar rose as a primary export. Hawaii became independently wealthy extremely quickly, signing dozens of international treaties, establishing independent sovereignty and neutrality in the League of Nations, and established embassies and diplomats around the world, including Washington, D.C., London, Paris, Berlin, as well as Japan and South Africa. On July 6, 1846, the US signed a formal recognition of Hawaiian independence. With rising economic opportunity, American businessmen and missionaries began to plot a coup over a number of years with the support of the US Navy. As the United States, a country built off the backs of stolen slave labor, expanded as far west as it could, it needed to continue its never-ending capitalist greed with imperial expansion into the Pacific. It began with sugar, but the ultimate goal was to build strategic military bases in Hawaii to establish violent dominance in the Indo-Pacific region while exploiting labor as well as land and water. On January 16th, 1893, Queen Liliuokalani, who led a progressive constitutional monarchy, was overthrown by the United States, who landed Marines from the USS Boston without permission or request of the Hawaiian government, claiming an imminent threat to American lives and property. 24 hours after landing of American troops, leaders of the armed coup read a proclamation deposing the Queen and establishing a provisional government of Hawaii. On July 7, 1898, the Hawaiian Islands were illegally annexed by a unilateral joint resolution creating the territory of Hawaii. To date, there is no treaty of annexation, and Hawaii remains a sovereign nation under military occupation. By 1919, Kanaka owned just 6% of the land, while corporations owned 74%. The 1993 apology resolution by the US Congress concedes that the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii occurred with the active participation of agents and citizens of the United States, and the Native Hawaiian people never directly relinquished to the United States their claim to their inherent sovereignty as a people over their national lands, either through the Kingdom of Hawaii or through a plebiscite, a referendum. Now I want to walk us through a number of Kanaka-led demilitarization efforts. The military Pohakuloa training area is a 133,000-acre live fire bombing range with 7 million rounds of various weapons fired annually. During World War II, US Marines began using the land for live fire training exercises. Pohakuloa sits on seized Hawaiian crown lands, known as ceded lands, taken at the time of the overthrow. Ceded lands are public lands and are required to be held in trust by the state for Kanaka beneficiaries and the general public at large. However, after World War II, the Army obtained a 65-year lease from the state of Hawaii for a single dollar. Since the 1960s, Pohakuloa has become a training ground for nuclear warfare. Depleted uranium, or DU rounds, were used to replicate the actual firing of nuclear weapons. Biannually, RIMPAC training exercises converge on Pohakuloa, with 22 countries participating in active war games. Every branch of the military uses Pohakuloa for training. The firing area has never been cleaned up, meaning the remnants from these shells are still in the ground and have been seeping into underground aquifer for decades. Even if the DU shells are no longer being used, as you continue to fire upon the area, the DU in the ground explodes, sending aerosol particles into the air, affecting the families downwind as well as the military themselves. The threat of widespread radiation and contamination in the area is real. Pohakuloa is also the site of sacred temples, heiaus built by elites such as Umi, and burial grounds. There has never been a full archaeological survey of these sites. In 2014, a lawsuit was filed suing the state for failing to protect the land under Pohakuloa and attempting to cancel the state's lease. In 2019, a court ruled in favor, and the Department of Land and Natural Resources was ordered to develop and implement a plan to ensure that public lands like Pohakuloa are cared for by the military. But there's been no follow-through or cleanup efforts. Pohakuloa's lease is set to expire in 2029, and the Army is currently negotiating with the state to extend it until 2078. The Army is currently conducting an environmental impact statement and accepting public comments. I will be sharing a form in the chat if you'd like to participate. Pohakuloa has the highest concentration of endangered species of any US Army installation in the world. The area is nonstop desecrated. You can feel the ground rumble when you are in the region, and it hurts your soul. Kanaka have fought for decades to close the base and end the lease. All live fire at Pohakuloa must cease immediately, and the area must be cleaned up. Kaho'olawe is a successful example of nonviolent direct action that resulted in the military turning land back after claiming it was critical for national security. After the Pearl Harbor attack, the US entrance into World War II, the military imposed martial law in Hawaii and took control of the island of Kaho'olawe for live fire training. In 1976, Walter Riddy and other members of the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana began a series of occupations on the island, risking arrest or death as they tried to stop the bombing. The PKO sued the Navy, and years later, the bombing was ordered to stop. In 1993, Congress voted to end all military use of Kaho'olawe and transfer the land back to the state, held in trust until the establishment of a sovereign Hawaiian governing entity. However, Kaho'olawe is still littered with debris and unexploded ordnance. The water table cracked and the work to restore the land is ongoing. Pu'uloa, now known as Pearl Harbor, was famous for its rich fish ponds and lo'ikalo patches, which fed thousands on the island. It has now been turned into a Superfund site after decades of toxic waste leaking from military installations into the water, one of 4 Superfund sites just on Oahu. North in Kapukaki is the Red Hill Fuel Facility. Initially constructed in 1940 to support US imperialist military ambitions in the Pacific with the capacity to hold 250 million gallons of fuel. It is the world's largest underground fuel storage facility, constructed just 100 feet above Oahu's sole source aquifer. Red Hill has spilled an estimated 180,000 gallons of petroleum since opening, including 3 reported leaks in the past 12 months. The Navy's own estimates are that chronic leaks from the Red Hill fuel tanks are probably over 5,000 gallons per year. Many of the corroding 80-year-old tanks have not been inspected in 20 to 40 years. The facility has been leaking directly into the soil beneath it for decades and is now entering the aquifer every single day. On November 20th, 2021, 14,000 gallons of petroleum spilled. However, the Navy did not alert Board of Water Supply, Department of Health, the public, or even their own service members who gathered for Thanksgiving dinners with their families that weekend, given no warning that their drinking water had been contaminated. Within weeks, hundreds of people ended up in the hospital. In all, 98,000 homes were contaminated, 2,000 people became sick, and hundreds ended up in the ER. The spill occurred within the Red Hill well, contaminating the Navy's own water supply, which also supplies 13 elementary schools as well as civilian housing areas. A lava shaft, located 500 feet from Red Hill, is Honolulu's main water source. It, along with 3 other major wells, have now been taken offline forever as a direct result of the contamination. Honolulu is now using backup wells and diverting water from outside the city to service its residents. We are currently in a water shortage with water restrictions in place that we expect to intensify in the coming weeks. The Navy finally announced in February that it would begin to move towards creating a plan to defuel and decommission Red Hill Fuel Facility. However, on their own self-imposed timeline. It took many years of public pressure from organizations such as Sierra Club, Hawaii Peace and Justice, and the Oahu Water Protectors. However, our fight is just beginning. Last week, the Navy presented these visuals, which clearly show a fuel plume is traveling west. Only 150 gallons have been cleaned up and recovered since the spill last year. This fuel does not simply disappear. It is actively entering our aquifer every single day and heading into new areas. Over the course of the last few weeks, hundreds of military families have begun reporting the same petroleum-related symptoms they experienced last fall. If the military continues to gaslight, claiming their water testing report no increased levels of contamination, the Navy has refused to commit to a defueling timeline, so we expect them to drag their feet and miss their self-imposed milestones. If the fuel spreads directly into Honolulu's water system, it will lead to the end of life on Oahu within weeks. We will face mass evacuations as all of our aquifers are interconnected underground. Honolulu will become uninhabitable without water. This is why we say Ola Ikapai, water is life. The Oahu Water Protectors demand that the Navy immediately defuel and decommission its Red Hill fuel facility. The only way to truly defeat the US industrial military complex is through a process of demilitarization and decolonization. Justice cannot exist for Native communities whose lands were stolen without the return of these lands and the restoration of their governing powers over the lands. Hand in hand with that comes a withdrawal of US troops from all around the world. The residents of Oahu are being asked to reduce our water usage by 10% as a result of the Red Hill spill. We say the Navy must immediately remove 10% of their troops from our shores. Military bases and outposts, especially those unused, must be closed immediately and returned to the Kanaka, along with the 200,000 acres of stolen crown lands that have been earmarked for resettlement of Hawaiians. I say that we as Kanaka move to reoccupy this land and build our own self-sustaining off-grid food sovereign communities. There are 250,000 Kanaka living in Hawaii, if we self-organize, we would only need 125,000 to pull in any direction to begin a process of self-determination as an indigenous occupied people. As Kanaka, we are the descendants of brave navigators who settled an oceanic continent of checkered island nations, and we will be victorious in our struggle to regain the self-governance and sovereignty of our homelands. Red Hill will be shut down, but that is only the beginning of our generation's fight for decolonization, deoccupation, and demilitarization. Makua Valley and Mauna Kea are next. True liberation from global capitalistic imperialism can only occur by coalition building to dismantle the American empire brick by brick. It will be accomplished by the working class and people from around the world working together, standing up against our collective occupier and calling for a true huli, revolution. I believe we can accomplish this together. This panel has been a great opportunity to learn, collaborate, and create pilina relationships with our hoa'aina and our hoa'velalike. Ola ikawai. Mahalo.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists for your great presentations. We're a bit over time, but we're gonna go into at least a few questions. And to start off, let's make sure everybody can see. I'm wondering if you all might talk a bit about ways to help politicize people and get them involved locally in these struggles, and to care about the importance of collective organizing. Like how can people help or be involved in these struggles in the region, but also around the world? It can often feel like a daunting task, US, military and imperialism, but what sort of, tactics and organizing do you think have been most successful in getting people kind of continually involved in these struggles? If any of the panelists want to talk a bit about that.
I can make a comment in response to that question. And so, as a unincorporated territory of the United States, as a non-self-governing territory, we don't have political power in the US system. And so one way, by way of support, is to utilize, if you're in the US context, to utilize your access to congressional representatives who actually have voting power, to be a voice for us in the territories in particular, because we've tried to work as well with our elected delegate, and we don't have a whole lot of luck. Someone once said that for those that are elected to US Congress, they're elected by the people, and within a year they come back to us as a representative of the US government. So it's not a very favorable kind of process, but if you can utilize the political support or the political power that you have as voting members of in the US context, then that would be really helpful for us by helping to advance our agenda.
And I can share as well on our end. The best thing that people can do is not purchase land in Hawaii. It's directly displacing our people. 50% of Native Hawaiians have already been displaced, and the rate of purchase of land in Hawaii is drastically increasing. I shared a statistic of like 1.2 million as the average medium house price today. In October, that was 1 million, and that was when it crossed. It's been rapidly increasing. And so, if you do visit Hawaii, be very conscious of our history, our struggle, spend money with local merchants, understanding that the hospitality industry mainly is helping, international or American corporations. That money is not trickling down to our people. So if you do visit, please be extremely conscious of that. And just education. I shared a video in the chat. That's just, a new video about Pohakuloa. And, follow our activists on Instagram and Twitter. It just feels like we're constantly fighting a battle every single day. In the last 24 months, 3 different burial sites, my personal family have been dug up, and I'm not the exception here. Every single day, there's something new occurring in Hawaii. And we're just trying to help the world be educated. The American educational system has basically hidden our history, as well as everyone else in this organization, within this panel. So please help reshare our information.
Great, thank you both. I think, let me see. So I think one of the sort of main things that the US uses in the region to legitimize its historical and ongoing massive military presence across the Pacific is China. And wondering if you might talk about what sort of ways can Pacific Islands work together with China and others in the region in a way that doesn't worsen or increase US militarization or embolden the US military industrial complex. Like, how can you push back against these Cold War rhetoric and these increasing escalations that the US has been pursuing? If anybody wants to, talk a little bit about that.
I mean, I think that's like a pretty difficult question, but I guess like one interesting thing would be like having a larger framework, how to understand the situation that's happening between China and the United States. And I think for countries like South Korea, it's like it wouldn't be that we should choose like China or the United States, but that we should be able to have like our own like self-determination, our own independence. I think Vijay Prashad talks a lot about this notion of like a non-aligned movement, like the smaller countries or the other countries kind of like being able to come together and not have to feel like they have to be drawn into one or the other sphere, but they should be able to come together in solidarity and be able to carve out their own space, right? To be able to practice their like national sovereignty. So I don't know. I feel like that's kind of something that's important because I saw that one of the questions was like, how do we make sure that we don't get pulled into, like around like China and whatnot? But I think the solution is to be able to kind of like carve countries coming together in international solidarity to be able to maintain their own national sovereignty and self-determination, free from the influences or free from having to be pulled in one direction or another.
Gerald-san from Hinada, there I found an important question about Okinawan independence. Can I answer or express my opinion about it? In the chat, one of the viewers, Pete Doctor, raised an important question about Okinawan independence. I spoke on behalf of Zenko, MDS, and the ZHAP campaign, not of indigenous Okinawan people. I am a resident in the mainland Japan. In that sense, I am on the side of colonizer, dominator of Okinawa people. So I am now engaged in anti-base movement in the mainland to spread the Okinawan people's voices against the military bases in Okinawa, especially the construction of Henoko base. And of course, I know that there is a strong voice for independence of Okinawa among Okinawan people. But the problem is the current anti-base movement, especially against the construction of Henoko new base. People are getting together around the issue of Henoko new base, you see, not around the issue of Okinawan independence. So the degree to which they commit themselves to the idea of Okinawan independence are different from person to person. So if we put the idea of independence before the issue of struggles against construction, I am personally afraid of some split may emerge in the movement, current ongoing struggles against Henoko or new base. recently, several years ago in Okinawa, they formed an academic society for independence of Ryuchuan. They say Ryuchuan instead Ryukyu. And, the interest in the idea of Okinawan independence is, I think, on the rise gradually. But, the majority of the people in Okinawa now, do not, among the movement, do not, put the issue in the center. So I'm not sure if I explain it clearly, but that is my position. And so I respect and support the cause of Okinawan independence. But as far as the issue of Henoko or construction is concerned, we get together on the issue. Am I clear enough, Gerald?
Yeah, thank you all. We're running a bit over time, so I think we can move on to the final. Okay, great. So here are the links in the chat. Thank you all again. Thank you to our panelists and for everybody attending. Thank you to the panelists for the great presentations and all the great insights, and for all of your organizing work, and for joining us tonight for this important event. We will upload all of the recordings soon and email it out to everyone along with all the info here. Before we close, we want to just share these links. We made this page on the DSA International Committee website where you can find all of the information from tonight and additional resources, and where you will also put all of the recordings later. And we encourage everyone to follow all of the panelists and the organizations and our co-sponsors to keep up with all of their important work, as well as see info if you are interested in getting involved with any of this organizing. And you can also join DSA and NDIC at these links to help us continue to build a socialist movement in the US and to expand our anti-imperialist and internationalist work. So thank you again to everyone and to our co-sponsors, Code Pink, World Beyond War, No Toll, No Cold War, Massachusetts Peace Action, and the Red Nation. All of them do important work. Everyone should check them out. You can see everything on the website, and we will continue updating that as well with more information. Yeah, thank you again for this. This is all very important work, and we're glad that we can all come together in international solidarity and help build out this movement. So thank you, everyone.